So, we've been studying John, and we've been starting to see, well, not even starting to see, we've been seeing the conflict going on in John. Last week we saw how the Sanhedrin put down Nicodemus, insulting him actually. And then we saw how the conflict between Jesus and the Sanhedrin has been progressing. And when we were going over this, I might even mention it to some of you. I thought of the levels of conflict that we'd studied in seminary, and I thought maybe it'd be useful. Especially when I heard about the fracas down in the shoreline and the conflicting accounts about that thing. And I kind of like the gossip better. It was a juicier story than the truth, but that's often the case, isn't it? You know, sometimes you really have to decide if a thing we disagree with is really that important to make a conflict over. But it occurred to me that we could find ourselves in situations of conflict, and it might be helpful to have some information that would help us to handle it and maybe even to make peace. As Jesus told us in Matthew 5:9, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." And I'd love it if the Baptists were to be known in this town as the peacemakers. Amen! That would be a switch, huh? Okay, the Bible tells us to live peaceably and pursue peace. And I want us to read together what the impetuous Apostle Peter taught his church about conflict. It's on the right side of this. This handout, by the way, this side is just for fun. All kinds of, that might be something useful there. Here's two kids. Their mom made them wear a big t-shirt that says our Get Along shirt. I thought that was a great idea. They don't seem too happy about it, though. But that's what that's about. And this one apparently came from a grade school. And you remember that book, Everything I Know That Was Important I Learned in Grade School, in kindergarten? Yeah, well, this is that very useful little circle there. But let's read this scripture on the other side. 1 Peter 3:8-12. Let's read it together. Hope I didn't make the type too small. Now finally, together, all of you should be like-minded and sympathetic, should love believers and be compassionate and humble, not paying back evil for evil or insult for insult, but on the contrary, giving a blessing, since you were called for this, so that you can inherit a blessing. For the one who wants to love life and to see good days must keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit, and he must turn away from evil and do what is good. He must seek peace and pursue it, because the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their request, but the face of the Lord is against those who do what is evil. So today, we're going to learn a little bit about how to seek peace and pursue it. Now here's a mind bender for you. Peace does not mean the absence of conflict. I think we have to get rid of a major misconception that conflict is always a bad thing, that it means I'm going to destroy my enemies. Today we will see how to destroy our enemies without hurting them. You see, conflict can be a blessing. How so? Well, for instance, you all know that you can't have a good story without some kind of conflict. Otherwise, it's just totally boring, a big description of something. A story needs a conflict. But also, in real life, no change or improvement at all ever happens without some level of conflict. It's how change happens. It's often upsetting and controversial, like our wonderful streetscape out here. As soon as I say that, I know blood pressure has raised in the room. And I'm going to give some examples of different things today, and I'm not really pointing fingers. I'm just random examples that seem to be appropriate for our situations. Yeah, it's hard for us seniors to change. Like my grandma Hanson used to say, even if it was good, I wouldn't like it. I think it might have been a Norwegian saying. She had a lot of those, but most of them she wouldn't translate for us. I don't know what they had in them, but did you notice when I said that even if it was good, I wouldn't like it? That it had a little barb in it? A subtle criticism. Yeah. Maybe a subtle criticism against someone who doesn't like the streetscape, to say even if it was good, I wouldn't like it. It's got a little barb in it, doesn't it? And it could hurt. We're talking about joking like that because the trick of turning a conflict into a blessing is in how it's managed. I'm going to describe some ideas about managing conflict. These come from my school notes and from some internet information I got. We're going to see 5 levels of conflict and 5 ways that people deal with conflict. And then next week we're going to look at what the Bible has to say about how to make peace, how to manage conflict in that way. So first let's look at 5 levels of conflict. This is according to a model developed some years ago by Kenneth Thomas and Ralph Kilman, and apparently more recently adapted by a guy named Speed Lees for church conflict. I've messed around with it myself and arranged it in degrees of conflict, kind of blended a few of these things together. I'm going to describe them for you, and perhaps now, the reason I'm doing this is you may be able to recognize some conflict situations you've been in and be able to identify them as one of these levels. And in the future, when you come into a conflict situation, you can see, oh man, this is getting to a level 4. Let's try to see if we can back this off. Hopefully you'll never get to level 5. Well, let's look at level 1. I put these little, I don't know what you call them, things at the end of it, little punctuation things, kind of describe what the thing said as well. So number 1 is the lowest level of conflict, of course. It's when you know there's a problem, it needs solving. Like what to, for example, again, I'm not pointing fingers or saying this actually happened, but like this strip of soil out here, for example, where it's by our new sidewalk. We were out there looking at that last week. So that's why it came to mind. Nobody's getting up in arms about this strip of soil out there. No one has their feelings hurt, at least not yet. We just need to agree what to do about it, make it happen, that's all. So we see the problem, and we have different ideas about it. Some say, don't do anything because the city's going to take care of that. Some want to plant grass, some want to plant flowers, and so on. And there's some good humor joking, like I think it was Gene said, why don't we just pave it? When we talk about it, we're very specific about the issue at hand. We don't generalize, saying a lot of people would blank blank. We disagree, yeah. It's a little unsettling to disagree about something, but we know it needs to be done. We work together, we get it done. Come up with a good solution, because we're focused on solving the problem. All right, that's level 1. Nice and peaceful, working together. I think even in heaven we're going to have that level of conflict, because you get creative people together, you're going to have different ideas, right? Second, disagreement. At this level of solving, the problem becomes less important than how people feel about it. Protecting myself becomes important now. Someone may disagree and feel that no one is paying attention to their idea. A person might feel threatened and have to defend their idea more vigorously. People aren't really hostile yet, but they're wary of each other. Statements start to get maybe a bit nasty. Maybe some barbed joking is going on, like, oh, yeah, sure, we could pave it and call it a bike trail. Little barb in there. Maybe a big barb. People won't say everything they know now, because they're kind of saving themselves, positioning themselves for a compromise they think may be coming up. Facts now become less important than how those facts are interpreted, because we've reached a relationship, personal kind of level at the second level. The third level is a contest. It's all about winning now. Our positions are hardening. We feel we are competing with one another. People take sides on the issues. We have, in my example, we have the grass faction, we have the flower bed faction, we have the do-nothing faction, and nobody takes the paving idea seriously, and now the person who suggested it jokingly is taking it more seriously, and everybody has dismissed her idea out of hand, and so she's upset, even though she started out joking with it. This hasn't actually happened, okay? This is an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. We are thinking now of us, them. We have divided ourselves into us, them. My group is virtuous and yours is evil. Facts are becoming distorted to reinforce my thoughts and my reasoning. I'm cherry-picking the facts, only saying the ones that support my idea. Does this sound like politics to you? I think political things are always this way. Both sides do this sort of thing. We begin to imagine, oh no, I forgot. People use generalized language. This is the kind of language we use. You always want to put flowers everywhere. Generalized language like that. Or, no one ever listens to my ideas. People start to imagine that they know what the other person is thinking. We start to do this kind of inventing of what the other person is thinking. And we come to believe that it's true, that they really are thinking these things that we've made up at this level. Has you ever been in a situation like that? Oh, I know what they're thinking. I know what they're saying. This is what they're talking about. And then we're making the whole thing up, and we believe it's true. Well, you know, she thinks flower beds are always a mess. And then people blame each other. Well, if someone would just do something, we could get this done. Never stopping to think who someone might be, although generally that person has someone in mind. At this point, strangely enough, at this point, no one wants peace. Everybody wants to blame the other side. Everybody wants to win. Fourth, crusade. Now the sides are really far apart and are exaggerating and characterizing each other. One is all this way and the other one's all that way. The problem to be solved is no longer important. We no longer really care about the strip of dirt out there. Now we're on each other's cases. The sides are more important. People talk with ideologies, like they quote Bible verses at each other, or the stuff from the Founding Fathers, and actually take what the Founding Fathers out of context and change everything all around so it supports their thing. Or we quote the Constitution at each other when it comes to political things. The factions form their own organizational structure. This is very interesting, I thought. So that the original group we were part of is no longer important. We identify with our own little group that we have developed, and it has an organizational structure of its own now. We don't even think about the original problem so much anymore. You find this going on when you read the news about the legislature? It isn't so much solving the problem anymore as supporting whatever side I happen to be on. You see that happening. So this is that contest level. People are now more associated with their sides as almost as if they were tribes or clans, rather than what they think are of ideas. Because, of course, we have already decided what they think, so we don't need to know what they think. People have become self-righteous by this time and want to have facts that support their righteousness. Now, what I mean is, by righteous, I mean this is the right way to do it, and what I know is the right way to do it, and the way you know it is wrong, and become very self-righteous. Both sides do. They feel now that the other side must be punished. That gets pretty serious, and that's this contest level. The other side must be punished. Which brings us to level 5, and level 5 is terrible. Level 5 is war. Joanne and I were in a congregation that actually got to level 5. I had a counseling session with a couple of people at level 4, and they were very surprised they were at level 4, and decided they were going to try and take it down a notch, but instead it went up to level 5. The ironic thing about it, this congregation actually valued personal relationships among the people. And yet, on one of the staff doors, he discovered a post-it note that was a death threat. It got to level 5. Needless to say, that church doesn't exist anymore in that form that it was in. The sides at this time, they want to destroy the pastor, the staff. They want to make sure they never have a position again. They want the other side out of the church. Winning is no longer enough. The other side must not only lose, must not only be punished, they must be destroyed. Level 5. Can you imagine a congregation at this level? Can you imagine a town at this level? We've been watching Under the Dome like last year, and that's the level they reached. They reached level 5. You can see this in some of the things you watch on TV. You can see these levels at work. No one, obviously, at this point, is thinking about any problem to be solved. The problem they think is how to destroy the other side. That's all they want to do, is eliminate those people. It's like the guy that killed those 2 teenagers in the news recently. He was so scared, he says, so afraid, that he wasn't going to just stop them. They needed to die. So he shot them again until they were dead. That's that level 5. Now, maybe you have been involved or participated or been surrounded by these levels of conflict. Maybe you recognize them. I mean, we've all been into these because they're kind of life, especially at level 1. So in the future, now, if we find ourselves in one of these conflict situations, how can we use the conflict to bring a blessing? Doesn't it seem kind of impossible? To prevent this conflict from becoming a curse in your community. Now, that's pretty tricky. To start with, we know there are 2 ways to approach a conflict. You can avoid it, or you can engage with it. First, let's look at avoiding conflict. There are patterns of behavior when we avoid conflict. We avoid it because it feels bad. We want everybody to be happy. I want me to be happy. I can't be happy if there's a conflict because I'm afraid I might get hurt. I might get hurt. I feel nervous when there's a conflict. I feel afraid. So I avoid it as long as I can. And when conflict isn't acknowledged and is just swept under the rug, people may forget it's there at all. But often, it festers under there until it gets out of control and explodes. Maybe it explodes in a meeting somewhere. And often, it explodes over something that had nothing to do with what made you feel uncomfortable in the first place. There's a psychological word for it, and I've forgotten what that is, but it's what happens. You feel all tense and you explode. Maybe you explode at your spouse over nothing, because this conflict's been going on somewhere else, and it's been put under the rug. People end up with hurt feelings, and the fellowship is broken. The group can no longer work together, or they're just together in name only, coming to church and not sitting near each other or talking to each other when a conflict is avoided. Okay, so we may not know how to handle conflict. So in order to avoid it, people will try to sound as if they're agreeing when they're not really agreeing. Have you had this happen? Have you been in situations like this? Pastor's gone to meddling now, right? I kind of feel like it. When a sensitive issue comes up, a person who's avoiding will try to change the subject. Let's talk about something else. Or, I don't want to talk about it. I was in a conversation years ago now about homosexuality, and I was very anti at the time, and this other person I was with, I don't want to talk about it. Shut it off. And I did the same thing in our ordination meeting with the other pastors. This guy was, I felt like he was just attacking me over nothing. And so I just shut down and said, I'm not going to talk about it anymore. And the rest of them were like, what? Don't you care about this job? I said, yeah, but I'm not going to sit here and be attacked, you know. So that's that way. I'm just not going to talk about it. Put it under the rug. Sometimes the people will try to release tension by joking about it. But in this situation, those jokes will very often have barbs in them, aimed at somebody that you're mad at. It has just this kernel of truth in it that hurts. And you meant it to hurt. You may not even realize it. So sometimes a conflict does just seem to go away. And sometimes they do if they're not that big a deal. But usually it doesn't go away. It becomes buried. And people cannot continue peacefully because they don't trust each other. They feel like they may be attacked out of the blue. And avoidance like this can create a very tense atmosphere. Maybe you're familiar with this in some of your own homes, your own families, a tense atmosphere because there's something been put under the rug. On the other hand, temporary avoidance can be useful. Sometimes it helps to give people time to cool off, to get rational. And sometimes once you're rational, you realize that you really don't need to address that particular issue because you were at fault or something. It's just something that happened. Sometimes it's okay to do avoidance. You don't want it to escalate. But if it's important, don't avoid it forever. People who want to avoid conflict now often see engaging as frightening because they imagine they're going to get beat up by an aggressive opponent. It's often the case. On the other hand, a person may view the other side as an enemy to be overcome. Neither one are the most effective way to engage a conflict because it usually escalates it and makes it worse. Let's change the way we're thinking about conflict, about engaging conflict. Let's see how it can become a blessing. To start with, we need to understand there are basically 4 ways to engage other people in a conflict situation. We can try to accommodate our opponent, we can compete with each other, we can compromise, or we can collaborate as a creative team. Let's look more closely at each of these alternatives. Accommodating your opponent means that you'll do whatever you can to yield to their wishes. It takes humility to admit that your idea wasn't the best one on the table, or it takes humility to admit that you are wrong and that you're escalating something that doesn't have to be. However, conflict is usually solved through accommodation. If it's solved through accommodation, then one person or one side will find out that they are usually the ones giving in. And then resentment is sure to build up. If this is your habit of constantly accommodating, you're going to become resentful. This is especially true if the other side feels like the person I was counseling once said, this is one of those people I was telling you about in that congregation, he said, whenever I accommodate or avoid, I feel like a cheap whore. He was not satisfied with anything other than competing. And so you can see where this went, if people are like that. He was more interested in competing than he was in making peace. And so you can see how an abusive relationship could build up between 2 people or 2 teams that have that kind of attitude. One is always competing and winning, and the other one is always accommodating. That's not going to work for very long. Accommodating. Competing. That can be useful when it's used as a game. Sometimes competition can bring out the very best in people as they work against each other. That's what our economy is built on. That's what businesses, they compete with each other, and it improves the product and lowers the prices. And so competition can be good. And like a sports teams competing with each other, they get better and better, supposedly. Or they hire people who are. But competition can become destructive. If one person becomes domineering with no consideration of other people's feelings or thoughts, it becomes destructive. On the other hand, a dominant person, here's a positive thing about it, a dominant person who just imposes their will, you can get stuff done very quickly that way. These other things take a long time. If it needs to be done fast, that's why some churches think they want to have a strong leader, because they want to see things get done more quickly than having a congregation decide everything all the time. But it can leave shrapnel strewn all over. It can result, like in a church, it can result in having a congregation that only agrees with the pastor. And it's a dangerous position for the pastor to be in, or any leader to be in, to have only yes people around. But that's what a dominant person can produce. And sometimes, like this fellow I told you about, competitive people, they just enjoy the process of competing. It's fun for them. And so they'll continue to confront, they'll continue to engage people with competition, they'll foster it, trying to maneuver a win for themselves. Have you ever been in a discussion group with two people like this? We had a small group, and we had two people who loved to compete with each other. And we'd be talking all amiably about something, discussing something, and these two guys, one of them would make a statement, and the other one would counter it, and then they had a game going, right? And so they have to keep going back, and the rest of us are like they're sitting around waiting for them to be done. You know, have you ever been in that kind of situation? Yeah, I think we all have. These guys just have to win, and that's the competing thing. It's okay if it's really a game, but it can be very painful. At any rate, the original issue becomes secondary to winning. Now, a compromise. This is what we're always asking the legislature to do. Compromise. And then the other side says, no, compromise is evil. But this is compromise. It's when two groups compete and both sides insist on winning. Those two may never be able to resolve their conflict because unless they begin to negotiate a compromise. Big words, negotiate a compromise. This is different from accommodation. Because in accommodation, one person's always giving in, right? Or one team's always giving in. In this case, nobody gets everything they want, and everybody has to swallow something they don't want. That's the way compromise and negotiation works. That's why it takes so long, because you have to go on and on and on and on, even to the shape of the table sometimes in politics. The truth is, in a compromise, everybody has to accept some kind of idea that's onerous to them. And so it's kind of a negative solution, although it works. It's not the best way. So we come to collaborate. It's best if the sides will collaborate, even though it takes sometimes a very long time. Because what you're doing is you're creatively developing ideas together, working with each other. In this company we used to work in, it was a creative company, we called it plussing each other's ideas. Instead of saying something negative against somebody or saying no or being nasty about it, we'd say, we're plussing your idea. That's a good idea, here's something beyond it, here's something else, here's something to build on it. So you're plussing the idea. The thing about collaboration is neither side gives in all the way, because there's nothing to give into. You're all coming up with this together. And as you might expect, communication is hugely important in collaboration. In the process of collaboration, you see these other methods working as well. People will accommodate each other in the process. They will compete for the best ideas against each other. They will compromise in difficult situations as they collaborate. It's all part of that process. But what makes collaboration really work is humility. It's not the humility of the doormat variety of accommodating all the time or avoiding. It's more like the biblical definition of the word meek. Do you know what that means? The meek shall inherit the earth. Meekness is not a doormat. Meek is strength under control. Strength under control. I like that definition of meek. The Bible advocates humility and meekness because they allow us to listen to one another, to evaluate what each other is saying. Because we come to the idea that my idea may not be the best one. There's humility there. It keeps us from reacting to one another. It keeps us from being afraid of one another or trying to be ambitious and put ourselves forward. We're all part of the team working to solve the problem. You can see you pretty much have to stay at level 1, conflict, to make collaboration work, don't you? You know, when you start to look at Bible stories, you start seeing these levels and these methods all over the place. It's kind of interesting to read the Bible with this in mind. And we'll, if I can remember to do so, we'll continue to do that as we go through John. We see them demonstrated over and over. And as you think about it, the Old Testament seems to prefer the method of I'm going to destroy my enemy and defeat them utterly. It seems to prefer level 5, at least in the stories. But you know, the stories in the Bible aren't necessarily patterns to follow. Hello? They're examples to teach us. And I think what they teach us is that that doesn't work. It never did work for Israel. So level 5 is not the preferred method in the New Testament. It prefers keeping the conflict at levels 1 and 2 through negotiation and collaboration. Now, the whole Bible demonstrates that levels 3, 4, and 5 just don't work. They don't promote the righteousness that God requires of humans. In fact, it's the very thing that beheaded John the Baptist. Level 5 is the very thing that crucified the Lord. So how do you destroy your opponent without hurting them? By changing them to friends and teammates. How can you change opponents into friends and teammates? What does the Bible tell us? By loving them. Next week we're going to look at biblical passages about how love deals with conflict. As the Apostle Paul told his church in Ephesus, and there's the other scripture I'd like us to read together. This is what Paul told them. When he says corrupting talk, he's not talking about swear words, by the way. Ephesians 4:29 to chapter 5, verse 2. Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you. Therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, as a fragrant offering to God. Amen.